The factories that once fueled the war effort, now empty and silent, stand as haunting monuments to a world that no longer needs them. Tire workers, once proud of tire contribution to victory, now face the grim reality of obsolescence. As the machines of war are scrapped and the workers' futures crumble, a question lingers. What becomes of the legacy of war production when the war itself has ended? The war was over. But for the factories that had fueled the war effort, the end of combat signaled the start of a far more unsettling chapter. Across Britain, the United States, and the rest of the Allied powers, vast industrial complexes that had once hummed with the production of tanks, aircraft, and munitions now stood eerily still. In the quiet aftermath of victory, the true scale of the crisis facing these factories began to take shape. What would become of the massive war machine built to destroy? And who would pay the cost of its sudden obsolescence? At the height of World War II, the Allied nations had operated with a scale of industrial power that was unparalleled. In 1943, the U.S. alone produced more than 96,000 aircraft, over 85,000 tanks, and millions of trucks and jeeps, often at a rate faster than the Axis powers could anticipate. The sheer magnitude of the wartime industrial output is difficult to fathom. A global network of factories, each working at full capacity to keep the war machine running. But when the surrender documents were signed in 1945 and the echo of bombs ceased, the need for war material vanished almost overnight. Factories that had been on the brink of collapse from the strain of war production suddenly faced a new enemy: surplus. As the Allies turned their attention to rebuilding shattered economies and societies, the infrastructure that had been the beating heart of military might was now seen as an immense burden. What once had been lifeblood now seemed wasteful, even dangerous. The war machine that had consumed entire cities, factories, and labor forces became obsolete. Overnight, the weapons and vehicles of war, the very products of these factories, were no longer needed. What to do with the immense industrial capacity that had been created? The first decision came quickly: repurpose. The term conversion became a familiar part of the post-war lexicon. But how could war factories that had been built to churn out tanks and bombers suddenly produce tractors or household appliances? The process wasn't simple. Many factories were so deeply specialized, so intricately designed to produce specific wartime products, that transforming them into peacetime enterprises seemed an impossible task. The immense demand for munitions, parts, and machinery to fuel a war effort had left no room for the tools of civilian life. Thousands of factory workers who had spent years constructing weapons now found themselves idle, unable to transition to new roles. In the United Kingdom, this issue was particularly pressing. After the war, Britain found itself saddled with an industrial capacity too vast for peacetime needs. The legacy of wartime production wasn't just steel and machinery, it was an economy bent under the weight of massive debt. In 1945, Britain owed more than £3 billion to the United States, a staggering sum at the time. The factory systems that had once been a point of pride for British industry now posed a question of whether the country could even afford to continue them. Many of these plants were in poor condition, worn down by years of non-stop production, with little maintenance during the war. They became increasingly difficult to sustain. In the United States, the scale of the problem was equally daunting, but here, the focus was on the economic implications. War production had created an economy based on endless demand for military products, but the end of the war brought with it a dramatic collapse in that demand. With factories left filled with unsold planes, tanks, and artillery, the U.S. government faced immense pressure to make decisions about what to do with the surplus. What was once a source of immense pride now became a symbol of potential loss. The famous arsenal of democracy had built a vast stockpile of weapons, but what did victory mean when no one knew what to do with the result? In France and Germany, both countries faced similar fates. France's factories had been devastated during the war, and the end of hostilities left them scrambling to rebuild. The German war machine had been dismantled after the country's defeat, leaving its factories in ruins. However, both nations still had a wealth of military equipment left behind by their former occupiers, which posed a further challenge for the Allied powers: disposal. The fate of captured German machinery, vehicles, and weapons became an ongoing concern in the post-war years. By the end of the war, it was clear that these war factories, once the epicenter of military ingenuity, were now a drain on resources. Not only were the plants difficult to repurpose, but much of the machinery itself was increasingly obsolete. The cost of maintaining these vast, sprawling complexes became more and more prohibitive. And so, slowly but inevitably, the factories began to close, one by one. In some cases, the decision was made to simply scrap the plants, an overwhelming task that involved the tearing down of entire buildings and the dismantling of machines that had once been symbols of national pride. Scrap metal and unused parts were sold off to other industries or melted down for reuse. The very machinery that had churned out tanks, bombs, and ammunition was now being ground into nothingness. In Britain, this process took on an air of finality. The government, already dealing with a shattered post-war economy, found it difficult to justify spending money on maintaining factories that could no longer serve a purpose. For example, the large munitions factories in places like Birmingham, which had been vital to the war effort, were dismantled, with their production lines reduced to piles of scrap. Over 200,000 workers in Britain lost their jobs in the immediate aftermath of the war as production scaled back, while others found themselves in factories that had little to no work for them to do. In the U.S., too, the consequences of post-war surplus hit hard. Even as the economy began to adjust to peacetime production, many of the factories that had churned out military equipment were either abandoned or repurposed for civilian goods that still struggled to gain traction. For example, the vast automobile factories in Detroit, which had made military vehicles like jeeps and trucks, had to be reconfigured for the production of consumer cars. But this transition wasn't immediate or easy. Many workers who had been employed in military factories found themselves suddenly unemployed. By 1947, there was a startling unemployment rate of 3.8%, which, while not catastrophic, was a dramatic rise from the wartime labor shortages. For many factory workers, this transition from war to peace was a jarring experience. People who had worked tirelessly to support the war effort were now left with uncertain futures. Women, who had flooded into factories during the war to replace men sent to the front lines, were pushed out as the men returned to their positions. The transition was not just economic, but deeply personal. And yet, for all the struggles and uncertainty, there were those who still believed in the power of the factories. Some saw the great potential in the unused equipment and machinery. Some believed that, if managed correctly, these factories could become vital parts of the new post-war economy. However, for many, this vision would never be realized. Economic realities, limited budgets, and the overwhelming task of converting war production plants left too little room for optimism. What happened next was neither quick nor easy. The vast factories, once the pride of the Allied nations, slowly but surely began to fade into history, their legacy obscured by the overwhelming forces of economic pressure, political decisions, and human cost. Factories were scrapped, workers were laid off, and the machinery that had once been a symbol of national pride turned into waste. The question remained, what would truly happen to the factories that had powered the war effort? How much of this monumental infrastructure would survive the wave of post-war change? As it turned out, the fate of these factories would be shaped by forces beyond the control of the workers, the governments, and the world that had used them to win a war. And as time went on, many of these factories would slip away quietly, leaving behind little more than rusted shells and the faintest trace of a history that had moved on. By 1947, the transition to peacetime was well underway, but the question of what to do with the factories that had once driven the global war machine remained unresolved. The once vibrant production lines, which had pushed the limits of industrial capacity during the war, were now at a standstill, victims of both economic pressures and the sheer scale of their own creation. For many of the Allied nations, the decision was made: dismantle, scrap, or repurpose. However, even as factories fell silent, the ghost of their wartime purpose lingered in the iron and steel that remained. In the United States, the conversion of war factories to peacetime production became an act of necessity rather than a triumph of ingenuity. By 1947, the government had officially closed many military production lines and sold off surplus military equipment to foreign countries or to private buyers. It seemed almost impossible to imagine that the sprawling plants that had once manufactured bombers and artillery could now be turned to building refrigerators or civilian automobiles. Some, like the vast automobile factories in Detroit, found some success in their transformation, but the process was slow. The factories were still designed for a different era, one focused on speed, volume, and wartime efficiency. There were few buyers for the surplus military goods, and even fewer for the machinery that had been designed for destruction. Many of the once bustling production facilities fell into disrepair, with some abandoned entirely. Even in the thriving post-war economy, these plants could not compete with the demand for consumer goods. As a result, large swathes of the American industrial infrastructure were left standing empty, monuments to the war that had ended so abruptly. In some cases, the steel structures were sold off to be melted down for scrap. Others were left to rust, slowly decaying in forgotten corners of the industrial landscape. The fate of these factories was not just one of decay. For many workers who had lost their wartime employment, the economic pressures became unbearable. It is difficult to overstate the extent of the economic crisis faced by former factory workers. With the cessation of war production, large sections of the workforce were laid off. In Detroit alone, tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs. In smaller towns across the U.S., the closure of a war factory could mean the end of the town itself. Cities like Flint and Detroit, which had seen explosive growth during the war years, began to experience a gradual contraction. The workers who had once formed the backbone of wartime production found themselves with limited skills that were no longer in demand. Many left for new industries or for the promise of better opportunities elsewhere. In Britain, the situation was even more dire. The government's decision to dismantle many of the war factories was driven in large part by the immense financial burden of maintaining them. Despite the sense of national pride that had surrounded the factories during the war, the country's economy was in tatters. The cost of rebuilding the nation was overwhelming, and much of the industrial infrastructure was deemed a luxury that Britain could not afford. The government sold off machinery, and entire factories were torn down, the materials repurposed for other projects or simply discarded. In some cases, British factories were retooled for post-war consumer production, but the transition was clumsy and inefficient. The workers who had once crafted planes, tanks, and bombers found themselves in the odd position of trying to shift to civilian production with little training or resources. Some factories, like those in Birmingham, struggled to convert their massive wartime production lines into anything remotely useful for civilian needs. These once thriving plants were abandoned or reduced to mere shells of their former selves, left to decay with time. The scale of the dismantling of these factories was staggering. In Germany, the Allied forces took a more direct approach to the destruction of industrial infrastructure. After the war, many of Germany's factories were destroyed as part of the effort to prevent the country from rearming. This destruction, however, was not without its own problems. In some cases, the destruction of factories went beyond military targets, causing collateral damage to civilian industries that were essential for post-war recovery. In Germany, too, the factories that had once been the pride of the Nazi war machine were left in ruins, and the burden of rebuilding fell to the German people. The fate of the factories in France, meanwhile, mirrored that of Germany and Britain. France had suffered extensive damage to its industrial base during the war, and the rebuilding process was slow and painful. Many factories were left to rust in the wake of their wartime use, and others were turned over to military production once again, albeit on a much smaller scale. The emphasis in France was on rebuilding the nation's civilian infrastructure, and the enormous war factories that had once churned out tanks and airplanes were left largely abandoned. The closure and dismantling of these factories did not just represent a loss of industry, it marked the end of an era. For many workers, the post-war period was an emotional and psychological struggle. The sense of pride and purpose that came with being part of the wartime effort was replaced with uncertainty. The workers who had built the tanks, the bombers, and the jeeps were now left with the debris of a war that had ended, wondering where their skills fit into a world no longer at war. It was a strange and haunting transition, one that is often overlooked in the grand narrative of post-war recovery. In the years following the end of World War II, the remnants of the once great factories became little more than a historical curiosity. Some were repurposed for new uses, either as civilian factories, warehouses, or storage. Others were simply abandoned, left to rust and fall apart in silence. What had once been symbols of national strength and technological innovation were now fading relics, quietly erased from the landscape of industrial history. The most tragic aspect of this loss was not just the physical decay of the factories, but the human cost. Thousands of workers, both men and women, had been employed in these factories. The sense of purpose that had driven them during the war was now gone, replaced with the cold reality of economic hardship. The work they had done, which had once been a point of national pride, was now forgotten or ignored, the products of their labor reduced to scrap.